Your geopolitical panoramic view on the Oracle Broadcasting. And on with me is a very, very special guest, and I've been looking forward to this interview for about a week now. On with me is my very, very special guest, and that is Kramer, and he is a writer, researcher, mystic, modern day shaman. You can go to his website, thecleaver.blogspot.com. Neil, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's good to be here, Michael.
Very much so. It's I've been following your work now for a while and just got around to contacting you for an interview. But for those of the people out there who might not know of you, please introduce yourself and your work to them.
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm a writer, a speaker, researcher at various conferences. You know, you get described as a mystic and a philosopher and all the rest of it. But basically what I'm doing is analyzing, as you put it, the sort of geopolitical landscape, introducing what you might call metaphysical themes of consciousness and spirit and multidimensionality and so on. And really what I'm trying to do is offer a sort of synthesis of all those things to say that, as well as looking at the, the 3D world around us and all the politics and strife and military-industrial complex and all the rest of it, that there is an essential component also to consider, which stems from something that in modern times we would perhaps refer to as metaphysics. In the old language you would call it spirituality. And I think that hopefully in my work over the last few years I've demonstrated that the two are pretty much intertwined, and they are dependent on each other and really reflections of the same thing. So most of my stuff focuses on consciousness, but I do make an attempt to offer the whole picture. So I do look at conspiracy, I do look at shamanism, use of sacred medicines, entheogens, and also ancient mystical traditions and esoteric philosophies to do with disciplines that have probably shaped history a lot more than most people would take into account over the last few thousand years, and trace the lineage of some of the people who orchestrate affairs now back to the roots of that, which lies kind of in the mists of time and well outside the mainstream. So part of the mystic's role, as well as trying to contact so-called ultimate reality, is to really bring a contemporary view of a lot of, as I say, ancient philosophy, and show how that is vital to today's understanding of what we see around us.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we walk around this world of ours thinking that we understand and know everything there is to know, but all philosophers pretty much said that we know nothing, and there's so much out there for us to find. And those of us who are not fulfilled in our lives, there's more out there for you. Don't just get caught in the rut and think that that's all there is to it. And we'll definitely discuss that because it's a big part of life, and a lot of part of our lives are just missing today. We think that we're supposed to be happy all the time. We think that everything's supposed to be fine. We're all supposed to be rock stars and millionaires, and that just ain't the truth.
No, that's right. I think you're basically outlining the fact that we've been very much brought up in a materialist, so-called reductionist mindset, in that we focus really on the accumulation of material resources, whether that's on a large scale to do with oil and money and so on, or whether it's a personal scale to do with luxury goods and holidays and cars and so on.
Absolutely. But I've got a quick break here coming up here, but we'll jump back on it up on the other side. My special guest, Neil Kramer, be back on the bed with the Vantage Point. Madonna said that she was a material girl living in a material world. And that is really, we think of life. We think that if we have, 50 HD TVs in every room, and we've got nice jewelry, we've got nice clothes and cars, and we're keeping up with the Joneses, that is all there is to life. And obviously, that is not all there is to life. There is much more out there to be had if you would only just take a look and maybe just shut off part of your brain that thinks that way. But on with my very, very special guest. Neil Kramer, and he's a writer, researcher, modern day mystic, philosopher, if you will. The website is thecleaver.blogspot.com, and we're talking about people who live in the material world when there's so much out there to offer them.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways of looking at this is that we live in a kind of multi-dimensional world. So one of those dimensions is the one we're most familiar with, the one we wake up in every day when we brush our teeth and go and buy groceries and get in our car and go to work and all the rest of it. This is what we could consider as the 3D world, the physical world of flesh and bone. And that is one way of looking at things. And what I do in my work is suggest to people, and perhaps the people who listen to this show will be familiar with these things, but in the mainstream it's quite unusual, in considering that what we're really looking at is different densities of energy. So if you consider that from a scientific perspective, perhaps, everything is energy vibrating, there are different densities and different resonances and different frequencies of that energy. So the chair that you sat on, the cup that holds your drink, the bed that you lie on, they're all made of energy. And we can represent that energy as a frequency. And this spectrum of frequencies, runs from low to high. So for example, we could say a low frequency energetic expression is the physical, as I say, the body, the physical world that we can see and touch and smell. When we move to higher frequencies, like thought and mind, that is still energy. It's no less real than the chair that you sit on. It's no less real than anything. It's just a higher form of energy. And we can move to even higher frequencies that move us into what we may consider as a metaphysical realm. So this is the world of the sorcerers and the shamans, the sort of magical realm of dealing with energy at a more direct level. And this was practiced for millennia throughout the world, throughout every continent. The Druids, the Gnostics, and many indigenous shamanic groups looked at this. And even within this schema, we can say that there are kind of light and dark areas. And what we tend to find is that when people start to analyze what's wrong with the world, the first thing they do, of course, is they look at the dark area, they look at the shadow area, and they look at the failing political systems and the government that doesn't really represent us at all. And I think even the most kind of rudimentary studies into this, we soon realize that the government really isn't for the people, the government is for the government, and there's different layers of this. And I go into that in my work, but we can say, if you want to put it a different way, that there's two ways of looking at the world. One is as service to others, and one is as service to self. That's one set of terminology. Another set is to be creative and selfless, or destructive and selfish. And all of that here on this earth plane happens within what I call the theatre of polarity. So we have these extremes in this world that we live in of, bliss and of agony, of wars, of all the problems in Iraq and Palestine and all the wars in Africa that we don't hardly hear about and all the rest of it. These things go on. Trouble on the streets, trouble in the homes, and then we get all the wonderful stuff, all the art, the music, the poetry, the real high points of the human spirit. And this is the theatre of polarity, energy bouncing from one end to the other. And we used to call it good and evil, but perhaps slightly more neutral terms, as I say, light and dark. And within this model, it shows us, through felt experience, actually what we do in our lives, that consciousness that flows through us actually impacts the world around us. So consciousness isn't this little thing that springs out of the brain. It's actually something that is a field phenomena, I would say, and we'll come to that later. But this consciousness in our head actually makes a difference around us. It changes everything we do. So this polarity, this experience of being born and living your life and then passing on to another place, that whole thing is a teaching mechanism in one sense. And in this model, there is a natural trajectory for human beings to move through these different frequencies and through these densities. In other words, to shift from lower frequency operation to higher frequency operation, to walk in olden times what you would call a spiritual path, a holy path, a sacred path. And this is what naturally, organically occurs when human beings are left to their own devices.
Well, look,
So
in that case, let me ask you the question. You know, there's a saying that says there's no genius without a touch of madness. You know, I mean, what's your opinion on mental disorders and whether or not their neural receivers are on a different frequency and they see a reality that we don't see?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that this introduces another interesting concept, fascinating concept of reality tunnels, which was a phrase popularized perhaps by Robert Anton Wilson in the sort of 60s. And a reality tunnel really is a way of looking at the world. But what was suggested then was that this reality tunnel is so distinct from one person to another, so particular to each individual, that if you actually shifted your consciousness into someone else's world, you would be like staggered at how different they perceive things. Even the same stuff that you describe, the room that you're in or the street that you live down, those things are seen in radically different ways. And what we find is that the systems of control that shape and orchestrate events in this world, they have a kind of vested interest in putting forward like a very, very consensus reality tunnel, one that has a defined number of squares, a defined number of pieces that you can move around, just like a chessboard. And it says, okay, guys, this is the chessboard that we're playing with, and these are the pieces, and that's it. And you can do whatever you want. You can move those pawns and queens and knights and rooks or whatever. You can do whatever you want with those, but that's it. That is the consensus reality. So when you, coming back to your question, when you encounter somebody who is clearly not operating on that level, who is not dealing with the chessboard, with those pieces in the normal way, we call them geniuses, or we call them schizophrenics, or we call them mad people, or we call them artistic people. And the severity of that label, whether it's a constructive one or a destructive one, so to speak, is dependent on how far outside that mainstream construct they are. So if it's Einstein working on his equations in a little office somewhere, wearing, you know, a scruffy old suit with his crazy hair and smoking his pipe, it all looks very charming and very eccentric, and we say, well, he's just a crazy scientist, but he's a genius, that guy. If the same individual with the same frequency is somewhere else and he's trying to work in a post office or he's trying to work in a factory in that same way and has got these huge eccentricities, people would think they're crazy, they would think they're mad. And that's because they're moving outside the mainstream consensus. And we all see that, we all feel it.
Well, hang right there. We're going
Sure.
to a quick break. The commercials always interrupt the fun stuff. Stick around for much, much more on The Vantage Point. My special guest, Neil Kramer. Welcome back to The Vantage Point, your geopolitical panoramic view, on with Neil Kramer. The website is thecleaver.blogspot.com. I urge you to go down there and check out his writings. Check out his new CDs and DVDs he has out on different subjects. Probably subjects we'll probably never bring up here. Too many subjects to discuss. But you definitely need to go there. Check it out again. It's thecleaver.blogspot.com. But continuing on about, you know, the different fields of reality and how different people see things differently from other people, and then sometimes we call those people crazy. And then, you know, it's really no difference between a genius and a madman. It's all about what he produces.
Yeah, it's about application and it's about centeredness. So if you suddenly start to hear voices and you're not prepared for that, then you know, you're going to be labeled schizophrenic and locked up if you're not careful. Whereas not long ago, a few 100 years ago, in Europe, people who experienced that, they were spiritual experiences, they were holy experiences, and people would write these things down and make amazing novels and poetry and music about it. You know, visionaries would frequently encounter so-called entities and channel information, which is really considered fringe, crazy stuff now. But people like William Blake, who was a very, very famous guy at the time, produced this astonishing artwork and literature and all the rest of it. And a lot of it was visionary material, which within a religious context was kind of acceptable because some of it would be couched in Christian theology and so on. But today, if you did that and said, I'm hearing voices and seeing things, you're going to get a lot of chemical stuff down your throat, or if not, you're going to get manacled to a chair somewhere. So we have to be careful with these things. But I mean, following on from what I was saying, I think what we're saying is that in this movement of energy from the gross level to a finer level, from a low resolution to a high resolution. We become more civilized, we become more compassionate, more intelligent, and we move, to what some people would call enlightenment, and that is a natural human condition. And what I've found in my work, particularly the early stages of it, some years ago now, is that there does seem to be an active system of suppression on Earth, unfortunately, which seems to hold down human consciousness and kind of stupefy it. And it's kind of like water that has become stagnant, and when there is no movement in this thing, it stagnates and it becomes grey and tepid and not very nice at all. There's no clarity, there's no purity to it anymore. So consciousness naturally wants to move, it wants to grow, it wants to express itself. And when it's not allowed to, it basically devolves and it becomes very inert. So understanding these systems of suppression, part of it, of course, is to understand the politics and the military aspects of it and the parapolitics and the exopolitics and all the rest of it, and all these researchers out there who focus entirely on that. It's very important stuff that people look at that. But there is another side to this, and the side is the consciousness, and that moves through the whole thing. And when you look at how that's actually applied in the world, the old term for it used to be magic or sorcery, and particularly in the 19th century and the 18th century in England and Europe, it was called the occult. And there was all these systems of organizing this stuff, and it was basically to bring about change in accordance with your will, which was a very popular interpretation of what magic is. I mean, we could say that today. You could say, I'm going to draw a car, I'm going to design a car on a piece of paper, and I'm going to bring that into manifestation through my production facility, Honda or Ford or whatever, and off you go, and you manifest that. The difference is that a sorcerer or a magician would bring this about in a very pure sense, in working with energy, in an alchemical sense. And, again, these things are just buried in the mists of time now, and particularly I live in New York State now, and after having been here for kind of 6 months, it's really amazing how there's such a massively short history timeline here, and that the mainstream story follows really that there's only sort of 200 or 300 years of worthwhile stuff to look at in North America. And really, the old places like Europe and Greece and, going into South America and the Mayans and the Amazonian basin and the Toltecs and Brazil and all the rest of it, that is part of the problem. Understanding history gives us a sense of identity. And without that history, it's not clear who we actually are and where we came from and what we're doing. And so there's two opposing views at the moment that seem to clash with each other. What the mainstream wants you to think, the consensus reality tunnel, is that we're basically kind of biological machines and we're here by accident, some kind of chemical soup accident where we spring forth from the ocean and, transform over millions of years from tadpoles to monkeys to men. And that is the materialistic, reductionist, scientific perspective. Let's imagine for a moment that wasn't the case, and that we're these kind of infinite divine entities with a soul that was indestructible, and our job actually was to come here and map creation, to navigate and explore creation through thousands of lifetimes over many different planets and many different solar systems. Just imagine that. You don't need to judge it and think that's true or false. Just imagine it as if it's science fiction. How those two different views make you feel about yourself. So one is that you're just a machine and you're a mistake, and one is that you're divine and you're here to do something really important. Now, if you knew that the latter of those two observations was true, it would change the way you live your life. You would not do a normal job. You would not buy into the mainstream culture, which is not exciting and colourful, and it does not derive from the people. The mainstream culture is a system of control, which is to say, here are the toys to play with. We don't mind what you do and where you go, but those are the toys you play with, and that's it. If you knew that you were from something far more exciting and majestic than that, you would create your own toys, you would create your own worlds, you would do your own thing. And that is part of this trajectory that I'm talking about, that reframing of what it is to be a human being, understanding what our identity is a crucial foundation aspect to this. It's the first step.
Isn't it much like how, any sort of information that knocked the status quo going back thousands of years was always stymied? I mean, you could be burned at the
That's right.
stake, you could be murdered, and it still goes on today because they're still trying to push that artificial system on us that we're a mistake and that we're worth less than nothing and that we're just useless eaters.
That's right, and as you say, there's many examples of that. And I did a speaking tour earlier in January from Los Angeles all through the major cities up to Seattle, and one of the themes was, people who got locked up for saying unpopular things, like Galileo for suggesting that the Earth wasn't the center of the solar system. They locked him up basically, and he died incarcerated in his own home. And that's what happens when you say something radical, and it's in the interests of the people who want to hold on to these reins of power, not only to keep you suppressed physically, but to keep you suppressed mentally and psychologically and spiritually, to say you are powerless and you're just a lump of meat and there's nothing much you can do, so you better behave yourself. And if you do behave yourself, we'll give you some rewards and we'll give you some toys to play with. And so we have to understand that this is complete and total artificial nonsense. And as soon as we understand that, and you can only do it through your own discovery, no one can tell you that, you have to actually find it out for yourself. And there's so much information out there, it's not difficult to do anymore, particularly with the internet. But you have to use discernment and critical reason and balance in this. You have to weigh different points of view. You can't just go onto a forum and believe it, or hook into a particular guy and believe it. You have to understand it through your own study. And it takes a bit of discipline to do this stuff.
Well, you know what, Neil? It's kind of like, we're coming to a break, but it's kind of like, I thought to myself over years of study that, my dad would tell me, like, okay, tell me basically, what the hell I'm doing in this world. But he was basically, crawling around same as I am out here in the world. And we don't have a guide to live by, but we'll bring that back up on the other side, a very, very interesting and introspective topic. Stick around for much, much more. Welcome back to the Vantage Point. VantagePointRadio.com is the website. If you want to be a part of the program, 1-866-841-1065. If you got a question or comment or whatever have you, on my special guest, Neil Kramer, the website is thecleaver.blogspot.com. You definitely need to go there. But Neil, what's your opinion for those who are just tapped solely into the social construct and the material world, and then they lose something valuable inside themselves, and then begin to rely on mood-altering drugs for help?
I think one of the things that you can use as a little yardstick is to understand that happiness is very much a byproduct of doing the right thing in your own life. Happiness is not really a pursuit in itself. It's something that springs out of when you are walking your righteous path, your authentic path, what the sort of used to be called dharma in the old days. If you're unhappy, it's a sign. It's a sign from yourself, basically, at a slightly different level, but it's a sign from yourself that you're off track. So unhappiness, if you really want to look at it from a very, very objective point of view, is a gift. And it says, what you're doing isn't for your good. It's not really the thing that's going to fulfill you and satisfy you. So when you feel unhappy, when you feel melancholy, or even depression, it's a sign that, to some degree, the way you live in your life and the choices you've made, it's okay, but you could have done it differently. So it's an opportunity to realign, to recalibrate what you're doing.
So now, like some sort of like incongruity.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's extreme cases of this, really massive chemical imbalances that really, move that to a different level. I'm talking about what we all feel from day to day, where, one day may be very similar to an ex, but on one day you feel fantastic, and on the other day you feel like very flat, maybe, or apathetic to what's going on. And I often find that in my travels and writings and my research that this is a pretty good tool to say, if you are dissatisfied with what you're doing in your own life, excuse me, then that's a good thing, because it shows you that you're not buying into the construct, into the false reality, into the matrix anymore, and what's happening on the television, and what the products are being sold in the mall, and all the rest of it, and all the hype about the sports games and everything. That stuff kind of tends to lose its focus with you. It tends to lose its luster. It tends to lose its glamour. and you actually sit back and think, is all this just a load of nonsense? And in your heart, which is always a better perceptive judge than your brain, your heart always knows basically what is going to give you energy and what is going to take energy away. And the construct, this fake culture that is so dehumanizing and so divisive, really always takes from you. It never gives to you. It always takes. It takes your money. It takes your energy. It takes your dignity. It takes your humanity. It takes your creativity. So they don't want you to do any of those things, because as you start to expand your consciousness, as you start to express yourself and be a loving, full, whole, vivid, colourful human being, then these systems of suppression begin to lose their influence on you, because consciousness really is pretty kind of indestructible. And as soon as you allow this conscious energy to flow through you, then you become connected, kind of like a computer becomes connected to the internet. You become much more than just this little guy or this little gal. You become something much bigger than that. And the influence of the mainstream media manipulation starts to wane, and you start to kind of spread your wings a little bit. So it's important to focus on your path. There is no one correct way of doing these things. But again, a good yardstick, a good kind of hands-on practical tool is do what gives you energy. Yeah? Do what gives energy to you in a constructive and positive way. So if that is ancient architecture, or if that is art, or if that is music, or if that is philosophy, or if that is languages, whatever, study, move your consciousness into a way that it's going to be able to express itself and expand. It's also important, of course, to look at what we described earlier as the shadow side of things, the political machinations and all these insidious, sinister maneuverings that all the governments are up to, whether it's in Israel or Pakistan or England or America. All the governments are up to kind of no good, really. They're all a bit naughty. And we know that. Everybody knows that. You don't have to work in the military or in, Capitol Hill to know that. Everybody senses that. And so if you turn your attention to your own life, into what you do, the people you interact with on a daily basis, what you do when you're in the grocery line, how you treat people, what you feel, your dreams, everything, as you start to do that, a very interesting thing happens, that the quality of your life starts to improve and the color starts to kind of saturate pleasingly back into it. And then another thing happens, which is you start to encounter what we call coincidences, which is perhaps a better word is synchronicities. And this is when you meet somebody that you're thinking about, or a special book kind of, falls off the shelf into your hand, or a particular film that you were thinking about, you see it the next day. And these are always supportive elements from the universe, another affirmation that you're on track. So as you start to think authentically and be who you actually are, outside of culture, outside of mainstream society, just to be who you are, these synchronicities come into your path that smooth the flow of your energy forward, so you can grow, so you can expand, so you can study, so you can be with your family, so you can travel, whatever it is you want to do. These synchronicities are always there to support that fact. And what you have to learn is to observe them and to see them for what they are. Because in my cosmology, I would suggest to the listeners that there are no coincidences. That doesn't exist. Everything has a purpose and everything has a role. Everything is unique, and yet everything is intertwined.
Well, yeah, I find it interesting also is that when you get on that path, and that path doesn't seem to end because there's so much more to find out there in the world, but there's also the gatekeepers that may be your friends, that may be your family, that notice something different about you, even if you're happy, and they see something that it's wrong, and they sort of drag you back to the group thing. As a matter of fact, I was in a movie theater and I saw these 10 guys, about 7 to 10 guys, all in Nautica striped shirts, solid pants, striped socks, and like sandals, and they're all like sort of huddled together, and I'm like, oh God, I mean,
I know.
And they.
Well, it's just a sign, isn't it, that if you don't think for yourself, you basically, it's like a computer default setting. If you do not think for yourself and you do not create your own reality, then you find yourself living in the reality that is someone else's creation. And that is not a good way to live. And sooner or later, whether you fall over dead on the golf course at 60, or whether you leave your job at 45, or whether you flunk out of college, you realize that that isn't the path for you. And rather than being faced with that crisis at a difficult time in life, meet it head on, see it over the horizon before it comes, and understand that there is an authentic, natural trajectory for human beings, and it's a good one. And if everybody was, cognizant of that fact and understood that this authenticity is a natural way, rather than living the inauthentic life of, modern 21st century materialistic lifestyle, then we would begin to understand that all the things that we want, the harmony, the love, the peace, the creativity, the dynamism, the adventure, the exhilaration. How many people have adventure and exhilaration in their day-to-day experiences? Not many, not many. And we love to see it, but we do it kind of vicariously through movies. But when you start to create your own reality, that adventure, that fulfillment and that satisfaction starts to soak back into your life. And your life becomes, you become the architect of your own existence again.
Well, what do you think about those? Like you said about creating your own reality. There's almost like a status quo reality where everyone is on these mood-altering drugs, and they have their own reality of where they see the world. It's kind of gray. It's kind of colorless and experienceless, and they seem to want the entire world and living in their reality. Children are on these drugs. I mean, it's rampant now, and it's like you be your own individual, live in your own reality, or you want to be a nice little marionette, popping the pills, taking the soma.
If you are living in a drug-induced reality state, whether that's street drugs or whether that's pharmacologically sort of official drugs prescribed from an MD, you are living as a machine, essentially, because you're not running your own operating system. You're not running your own programs anymore. You're running someone else's programs. And so it can sometimes, in very, very rare circumstances, be a way of getting out of a difficult situation, but it has to be managed very carefully. When it becomes part of a staple diet, that's when we encounter danger. So giving Ritalin-type drugs to kids in school is a really bad way to go.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming up to a quick break, and we're going to jump back up on the other side. This is the Vantage Point. My special guest, Neil Kramer, back for more. I'm your narrator. I am Michael Vail. The website is VantagePointRadio.com. On my very special guest, an interesting person, and has said some things on this air that a lot of people will benefit from, including myself. Go to his website, The Cleaver. That is, the website is called The Cleaver, thecleaver.blogspot.com. And Neil, let's just jump into some of the control mechanisms and how they keep people as dancing marionettes.
Well, the control system, as I call it, is what some people call global government, some people call the New World Order, some people call the Illuminati, whatever. I call it the control system because it's kind of quite neutral terminology to say, whatever way you look at this, however old you are, whether you're 25, 45, 75, it doesn't matter, we can all understand that at some level there is a control system. My understanding of it is that it's kind of multi-layered, and if people are interested in delving further into that, as you mentioned one or two times, go and take a look at the website, thecleaver.blogspot.com, and there's an essay called Demystifying Illuminist Power Structures, and I go into that in detail there. At the physical level, there are many ways that they put forth this control with, food that is going to kill us, with neurotoxins, with water fluoridation, with vaccination, with kind of, things that alter our brain chemistry, as in aspartame and all the rest of it, genetically modified food, all these kind of horrible dystopian science fiction nasty things. They're all there, but most of the time we can make a choice to minimize that and to not come into contact with it. But the chief weapon in this is the media. Media brainwashing is the biggest single weapon now, at this present moment in time, in 2010. That is what they use to tell people what to think. Most people in the olden times would find themselves in a situation where they're sense of authority came through the church. And particularly if you study British history, which is, one of the sort of clearest examples of that, the church told people what to do at a very, very real level. And I'm not talking about, the nice kind of community-based local churches that did, some good community stuff and good work and gave people a sense of belonging and all the rest of it and some kind of sacred experience. Those things exist. I'm not criticizing that. That's fine. I'm talking about the sort of monotheistic, doctrinaire attitudes of, the ruling elites who used religion to do it. Fast forward a bit, a few hundred years, people cottoned onto that and thought, this is a load of you-know-what, and I don't believe it anymore. And people started to rebel, and the peasants, who'd been slaves basically under this enormous feudal society, working for corrupt lords, unfortunately a lot of the time, they revolted, and they took this right to the heart of London, and most of them kind of got slaughtered doing it, but it directly affected things. And so church was replaced in England by what we now call parliament, government in other words. And government became the way of doing these things. As the printing press developed, then people started to get information out again and say there are other ways to think about things. There are other possibilities. Do you know what's happening in the village next to you? Do you know what's happening in the country next to you? Because people did not know. And then as we see the dawn of electronic information, we can now really kind of sit at a desk in your own home with your laptop or whatever, and you can study and find out pretty much anything that you want to, anything. And as I said before, you have to use judgment and discernment with this. You can't just believe what you read on our webpage. You have to balance it. You have to study. It takes a bit of work to do this. It takes effort and focus. But what you find is that most people can't be bothered to do that. And what they perceive as the news, in inverted commas, is what comes out of CNN, what comes out of Sky, and what comes out of the BBC, depending on where you are. And that stuff is not news. That is not news. That is official government propaganda. And if you investigate any controversial story thoroughly, you always find the same thing. And a good exercise to do on this is, if a big news story comes out, like let's take a recent example, the Iranian president Ahmadinejad gave a speech recently, and he said that 9/11 was a bit of an inside job. Obviously, a very controversial thing to say, particularly considering that I think he was delivering that speech in New York, if I'm not mistaken. Very, very provocative thing to say. Now, if you go on the internet, find a CNN report of that, find a BBC report of that, find a Scandinavian report of that, find an African report of that, find an Al Jazeera report of that, and you will get many, many, many different views on it. And you will get perspectives that you hadn't thought of before that never get covered in the Western media. And so, because of the internet and how easy it is to throw information around and sift through it and disseminate it and so on, that is an interesting technique just to demonstrate, just at a very practical, simple level, how each different news network spins a story for its own population. So in that case, you will see some startling inconsistencies in what actually happened, and the people who walked out, the people who stayed behind, what else was said, what was constructive, what was pointless. It's an interesting exercise. And so the media is really very much, unfortunately, I know this is a strong word, but a brainwashing tool. Most people who walk around and, you encounter on the street, let's say, have no idea what is going on in the world, because their only source of information is the mainstream media. And if that is your only portal, your only window onto the world, then you are getting an extremely narrow set of perspectives on what's actually going on. So the punchline to this little tract is this: you have to find your own news. And there's no excuse not to do that, because you can do it on the internet very easily, and there's tools that will enable you to do this. What it does is, again, as I say, it gives you perspective on these things, and it gives you an idea of what government is actually up to, because only from offshore, if you like, from abroad, from overseas, do you get these perspectives. So even between the UK and America, you get massively different perspectives. During the Vietnam War, BBC coverage of what was going on was massively different to whatever the dominant network was at the time, NBC or whatever it was. It was hugely different, and Reuters' international coverage was hugely different than American. It's very, very tightly controlled propaganda, and it always is during wartime. So if you analyze what goes on in Afghanistan or Iraq, the worst place to do it is by the media owned by the country who are perpetrating that war. So yeah, there's a human aspect to this. I'm not ignoring that. But just the information, just the messages that go out, it's useful. And it's an sign of intelligence, as somebody once said, to hold these two opposing views and still be able to remain sane, to understand that there are different ways of looking at the same object. So just like if you put a diamond in front of you on the table, as you walk around the table, you see different perspectives on that same object, different ways the light hits it, different angles, different shadows, etc. News is an artifact. News is an object. News is a system of energy just like that. And whoever tells that news, whoever edits that news, has the luxury of shaping it however they wish. So it is incumbent on us with this gift of the internet, which, may not always be around in its current shape. So let's use it while it's still here and relatively free and open.
Absolutely.
The internet gives us the opportunity to do our own investigation, our own diligent research, and that's a starting point for this stuff. So very often people who are starting on this path of knowledge and of true spiritual independence and being a true authentic human being need to go through a lot of information, and I think that's a natural first stage. And in the old days that was very difficult with libraries and books, and it was a very linear process. But as I say, because of the tools and the dynamics of how the internet works, you can throw this information around and sift through it and filter it and search with it very intelligently, very, very quickly. And when you do that, you come away with a conclusion. And I won't be spoiling it by telling you what it is before you've found it yourself if you haven't already. And the conclusion is this, that the media is very, very biased, very biased. There is no objective media. The BBC used to be it, the last one. That's gone now. BBC is no longer an unbiased, unprejudiced news source. It is government propaganda. And we have to accept that. But you can only accept it through your own study, through your own exploration and your own experience. If somebody just says it on a radio show, whatever. But if you go and do it and sit there with your cup of coffee and look at it and find it yourself, you realize that it is actually the case.
Very interesting. A quick break. Back for more on the Vantage Point. The website for Neil is thecleaver.blogspot.com. 1 hour down, second hour underway with my special guest, Neil Kramer, and the website is thecleaver.blogspot.com, and talking about everything under the sun, and it really about you, about the self, and about who you are, and really what it is that we're supposed to be doing. But one thing I find interesting, Neil, is that the so-called normal people frown on any sort of esoteric information or otherworldly knowledge, but the global aristocracy, if you will, has been heavily researching these subjects since day one. So what is it that they understand that we don't understand?
Yeah, that's a key point to this, because a lot of people who are comfortable doing political research, when they come across the word spirituality or consciousness or occult or mystery traditions and so on and so forth, they suddenly think, oh, right, okay, it's just tips over into fringe nutter territory, as we would say. And that's a mistake. That's a mistake, because if you do study the lineage of particularly the monarchies, who were the oldest sort of lineages we can track, you discover a very startling thing, and it's this: most of the monarchies that we can see today in the present form, particularly in the UK and Europe, are steeped in the occult. They have intimate knowledge of the occult. Most of the churches, but whether they be Jewish or Christian or Catholic or Islamic or whatever, are also similarly steeped in the occult. And a lot of the things that we feel are our quaint festivals and calendar anniversaries and Christmases and all the rest of it actually come from very, very mysterious sources to most people. And not only has this knowledge been really sequestered and kept away, a lot of it is in archives, in Catholic archives in the Vatican, which is, a matter of record. It's just fact. It's well known that it's not conjecture anymore. When a dominating empire colonializes a new land, the first thing it does is take all the information away, all the records, all the history, and all the rest of it. And when that was represented by a library or by an institution or a building, it was quite easy to do that in times gone by. So all these fabulous libraries of all this wonderful, empowering, enlightening knowledge of different ways of harnessing the Earth's energy, of communication, of technology, all of it's disappeared. All of it has been sequestered, has been co-opted, has been taken away, used, transformed, distorted, whatever. And they use it for their own purposes. But the key thing from our perspective is it's been taken out of the public conversation. We don't have access to it anymore. So we are under the impression that everything was a bit basic and a bit rubbish and a bit rudimentary up until 100 years ago. And that's when technology started to advance. We'll come to this after the break in more detail, but not at all, not at all. Technology, from many different perspectives, was hugely, hugely advanced in millennia gone by, but we do not have a record of it. So another part of this investigatory trail is to understand that the normal, linear, mainstream historical timeline is synthetic. It is neutered of all the juicy bits and all the real stuff and all the interesting things. They're just not there anymore. So again, once more, we have to go to the fringe. We have to use our discernment and understand that there are people out there, independent investigators and researchers and historians, geologists, archaeologists, are doing incredible sterling work to uncover the real history of where things come from and how long we've been here and what we used to look like and what we used to do. And that, again, informs us about our identity, where we come from.
Absolutely.
Directly affects where we're going to.
Well, matter of fact, we'll pick this back up on the other side. Short break segment. Stick around for much more. Welcome back to the Vantage Point. Every Sunday from 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time, I'm your host, narrator, Michael Vail. The website, VantagePointRadio.com. On with my insightful special guest, Neil Kramer. The website is thecleaver.blogspot.com, and we're really talking about how the interesting parts of history as an esoteric nature and any nature that's beneficial has just been redacted and been removed.
Yeah, indeed. And I think initially when people start to look at history and realize that what is taught in schools and colleges and universities and so on is a load of nonsense, initially it's very disconcerting that, and people often undergo this kind of cognitive dissonance where you just feel uncomfortable and you just feel terrible and you've been lied to and you realize you've been lied to and you just do not want to proceed to that understanding. And very often when people reach that sort of gatekeeper, which is quite a bleak moment for many, again, however old or young you are, whatever your background is, it's the same for everyone. People turn back from that and think, oh no, I don't want to live in a world where I've been lied to all the time. The reason it's worth going through that and moving through that kind of dark night of the soul is that once you do, you realize something important, that when you understand the true picture of history, things make more sense. Things make more sense from a political angle and a military angle, but they also start to become a little bit more fulfilling as well. And you understand the very key thing, which is that part of understanding our identity as human beings is to do with timescales. And one of the key tools that the control system uses to manage us as human beings, to restrict us, is to give us this extremely brief and narrow timescale to say, look, we've really only got this much amount of history and we don't know anything else, so let's just concentrate on these last 300 glorious years of all the exciting things that happened. And then before that, it was all a bit hazy and there was like Dark Ages and Greeks and on something. And anyway, never mind about that. Let's look at the Industrial Revolution. And they give you this extremely small, little tiny thing. And the mainstream science, if you look at it from a broader perspective, would say that as these biological machines descended from apes, we've only been around for 200,000 years at best. And man didn't really exist in his present form before that. And yet, there are hundreds, maybe more, thousands of suppressed archaeological finds that you never see in the mainstream, and yet they are there for everyone to study if you use your critical reason, your analysis, get the books, get the internet stuff, have a look at it, go to the conferences. These finds show that man has been around for millions of years, maybe even longer than that. Maybe there's some studies to show 60 million, 200 million years. So certain artifacts found in substances that do very well over time, like volcanic ash layers in the geological record, solid rock and amber, artifacts found in these suggest human presence for an incredibly longer time than expected. And guess what? When these finds come up, they get crushed by mainstream science and ridiculed straight away. But it shows us that the human story is a lot longer, a lot more mysterious, and a lot more fascinating than we were led to believe. And to cut a very, very long story short, because we know we've got limited time here, what seems to be the case is that there occurs on Earth a cyclical series of what today we would call cataclysms. And these things fall upon the Earth and recur in like proportionate cycles of 25,000, 12,000, 6,000, and 3,000 years. And these things correspond very exactly to larger galactic and solar cycles. And when these things happen, which are things like cometary impacts and massive solar flares and radiation and floods and the moon changes orbit and all this kind of stuff, it has a dramatic impact on the face of the Earth. And so anything that isn't basically rock disappears, okay? So if you take a lump of plastic and fast forward 200 years, it's completely vanished. Metals completely vanish over thousands of years. So anything over a certain timescale, it's not there anymore. So we have to look at rock very often, or things that are preserved in as I said, stuff like amber. We know that things like dinosaur fossils and little mosquitoes and stuff occasionally get trapped in amber millions of years ago, and they're still there, preserved perfectly. Well, there are cases where human artifacts, human-designed tools, or intelligently designed tools, whether they're human or not remains to be seen, have suggested that this timescale is massively longer than we thought. And this changes everything. This changes the way we look at ourselves, and it changes the story. And so all the history books, basically all the textbooks in all the universities, imagine they'd have to all just go on the fire because they're all incorrect. So this huge reevaluation can never really be allowed to happen. So it will gradually leak out over hundreds of years that things are different than we thought. But we already know that conclusively, really well evidenced, really credible sources are saying this now. But again, it is not in the mainstream, so you have to go and find this for yourself. And, identity is a key thing with this. So our own personal identity in our day-to-day lives matters. Historical identity matters a lot. To imagine that there were no human beings in North America 100,000 years ago is ridiculous, but that is what the mainstream would have you think. It's ridiculous. Of course it's ridiculous. What does explain a lot of these is these recurrent themes of cataclysm, of massive events that change the face of the Earth. And these were, of course, explored many times by many philosophers, many Vedic and Sanskrit philosophers, and also in contemporary times by renegade authors and scientists who dare to put out these suggestions that the solar system is actually quite a tempestuous and violent place. And it doesn't go on these millions of years of slow cycles. Big dramatic things happen all the time that change the whole landscape. So basically, the Earth gets rebooted every few thousand years.
Interesting. You're right, though. I mean, because while you and I, are shown, videos of cavemen, walking around on all fours and hitting each other in the head with big old bones, you think that's who we are, I mean, that's gonna degrade us to a viewpoint as a people to think that that's all that we are and that's our ancestors. And then there are people out there, like I said, as I call them, the global aristocracy, who are out researching, looking at the Akashic fields, looking at the noosphere, looking at all this information.
The science and the metaphysics is incredibly important to the control system, and they have all the sort of key records and information about this. They're not the only ones with it. There are other more free-thinking sovereign beings who care about humanity who also possess it. But again, it's not in the mainstream. You have to go and seek it out yourself. So the real history of humankind is much more interesting, much more intriguing than you would possibly believe. But it's so wild, it's so out on the fringe, this stuff, that you have to approach this information with no belief system. If you go into it with your Christian or your scientific or your humanistic belief system, you're going to stop at some point and not go any further. So you don't have to eject them altogether. If you've got a belief system that works for you, fine, just pause it while you do the work.
Absolutely. We're coming to a quick break. We'll bring it back up on the other side. Neil Kramer, thecleaver.blogspot.com. Back in a bit. Welcome back to the Vantage Point on my special guest, Neil Kramer. The website, thecleaver.blogspot.com. You definitely got to check it out. And really, can we admit as a people that we know nothing?
Yes, I think that's the starting point. The starting point of the whole sacred journey of being an authentic, brilliant, magnificent, majestic human being is very simple. It's this statement: we know nothing. Nobody knows nothing. It's hilarious. We all come in with a totally blank slate. Nobody really knows what's going on. Even the people who've got all these secret records, it's all just conjecture. It's all just guesswork. And there is no map. There's no guidebook. There's no particular solid path of doing it, and that's the whole point. We live here in this total free will zone. We can do anything we want, and we're taught that isn't true. We're taught that there's certain things you can do and there's certain things you can't do. You can do anything that you want, and the thing that guides you, of course, is your own code of conduct, is your own sense of ethics and morality and common sense. And we all have that as human beings. I'm quite an optimist as far as the human race goes. I think that humans are essentially good. And I think they only go off track when the consciousness is squashed, is suppressed to a ridiculous degree, which at the moment, unfortunately, it is that way. But this has been going on for thousands of years. It's not new. Just because it's very in your face now doesn't mean that suddenly, the wonderful America and Britain of the 1950s, where everything was so lovely, suddenly that's all turned to, horribleness and it's all terrible. No, it was always like that. It's just that now we have the information about it. It's like, when a sort of police force starts to collect crime data in a more efficient way, guess what happens? The crime rate appears to go up. It's because they're collecting more data and being more efficient, and that's what the internet has done. It's shown us what a crazy bloody place that we live in. But, information control, just coming back to that for a second, is a key thing. Excuse me, and I'll give you an example of that. In kind of ancient sort of Catholic history, in 1422, Pope Gregory V founded this organization, which was a congregation for spreading the faith. In Italian, the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, and this is where we get the word propaganda from. And the object of the group was basically to go around and spread Catholic doctrine as far and wide as possible. But this word propaganda now has, really replaced, a lot of that original sort of stuff with something even more sinister. And I would suggest that anybody who's interested in examining the control system and how it works and what it looks like from an inside point of view, go and read George Orwell's novel 1984.
Absolutely.
Because Orwell, not only is it worryingly, funnily actually come to pass now that his novel from 1946 or whenever it was, or the 40s anyway, his novel is there. It's real now. And it's very interesting because Orwell himself, he was part of the system at one point. And,
he was a propagandist, as a matter of fact.
He was. He used to work for the Ministry of Information. His name was Eric Blair at the time. And, over time, Orwell sort of grew increasingly sort of frustrated and disenfranchised with what actually the government were asking him to do. And he realized that they were warping news coverage during the war, not just for the good of the nation, but to get people to think about the war in a certain way, not independently and fairly, but in a very unbalanced way. And eventually Orwell resigned in, disgust at this. And he said himself, and I'll quote him, I've just got this little snippet in front of me. In 1946, Orwell said, "Political language, and with variations this is true of all political parties, from the conservatives to the anarchists, Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. So Orwell saw this. This is not new. In the 1940s, this was really, really going on, and it's like, it's a disgrace, you know. And even now, we have these things in the UK called D-notices, which are like gag orders. And these, again, derive from wartime, where when a particular like hot news story came out that might be a bit provocative or controversial, the government had the right to gag that from ever hitting the press, basically. So this gag order, a news blackout, essentially. And you had to do it by law, and if you didn't do it, you could be imprisoned or executed. So the media outfits, you know, just behaved themselves and did it. But we still see this in operation today. And in the UK, as I say, these D-notice things were originally to protect national interests, and they claim that they still are. But what they really are is they're a way of censoring any sort of unpleasant news story that the government doesn't like. And this goes on all the time. And it takes information out of the mainstream altogether. And worse than that in some cases they can kind of like lock this information away quite literally for up to 100 years. So if that's something controversial, like an assassination or a war or something to do with paedophilia or so on, which all things that have affected the UK government in recent times, basically that's information that articulates all these, you know, amazing stories that are in the public interest to know, is all locked away for 100 years, which is really when everybody who's involved or influenced by these cases is dead. So that's what it's for. And I'll give you one controversial example of this just to spark people's interest. One example, a few years ago, there was a big operation looking into ritual child abuse and paedophilia in the UK called Operation Ore, and it was like a joint operation between many international intelligence outfits and police and what have you. And Tony Blair issued a D-notice, our Prime Minister at the time issued a D-notice, a gagging order to protect prominent government figures who were involved in paedophilia. Apparently the names of these senior MPs, members of parliament, were known to the CIA, the Mossad, MI5, MI6, and it was kind of no big secret, but it never hit the public mainstream news, didn't happen. So, you know, there were even suggestions that this might have been used by the US government as extra leverage to coerce Tony Blair into supporting the Iraq War, which in the UK and in Europe was massively, massively unpopular. People could not believe that it was going to happen. And, you know, perhaps this disgraceful sort of paedophilia thing that the intelligence services, of course, know all about it is going on. And, you know, this is a very sinister thing, and all these, like, occult ritual things that involve children are just disgraceful and just inhuman, and a lot of this stuff goes on all the time, and it emanates from Scotland and Belgium and Portugal, and many sort of prominent alternative researchers you know, outline how this happens and why it works, and it controls the lives of thousands of children across the world. And even in the US, there's lots of credible evidence to show that ritual child abuse and sacrifice within an occult context is, you know, prevalent within many religious, powerful organizations. And yet the media has been instructed, both covertly and overtly, to ignore this reporting. Any investigations that do get carried out are invariably just in name only. They're designed from the start to uncover nothing and to protect the people who are actually doing this stuff. So that's how dreadful gag orders, D-notices, media blackouts can be. It stops really shockingly important information to get into the public. Because what would happen then? If you knew that your government was involved in these things, what would that do to the government? It would bring it down overnight. So that cannot be allowed to happen. So in terms of the magic of human history, that also cannot be allowed to happen because it would bring down the government overnight. So they are protecting themselves. Not us. They're protecting themselves by hiding this information away.
They are above the law. That's what it means.
There is no law for them. It doesn't touch them at all. Definitely not.
Yeah, the law doesn't exist for them. But we'll bring this back up on the other side. Special guest Neil Kramer. The website thecleaver.blogspot.com. Back in moments. Welcome back to the Vantage Point. I'm your narrator and radio host, Michael Vail. On my special guest, Neil Kramer, the website, thecleaver.blogspot.com. Neil, you said something on a radio show that really blew my mind, and that was that the whole idea of freedom and liberty is sort of playing with a part of the piece of the game that they want us to play. And I had read a book by B.F. Skinner called Freedom and Dignity, and where he said that whether or not we give some sort of stimulus to the people, and where we restrict the freedom, they get upset about it. But if they feel that they have freedom, even though it may be an illusion, then they're quiet as church mouses.
Yes. Well, the whole idea of liberty and freedom, if you give freedom to somebody who is saturated in the mainstream culture and who really all they know what to do is, watch TV and maybe play golf and go to a game and drink a few beers, what are they going to do with that freedom exactly? What are they going to do with it? So if you give them $1 million and say, okay, you don't need to go to work anymore, what are they going to do? Get a bigger TV? Go to more games? Going to get some new teeth sorted out for themselves? What are they going to do? So freedom becomes important when your consciousness develops. And up until that point, it's basically irrelevant to people. What is considered freedom today is the ability to shop where you want to shop, to go to whatever store, to wear whatever color trousers you want to wear. Most people consider that to be a sign of freedom. Real freedom is always freedom of consciousness, is freedom of, your own self-sovereign being, your own autonomy as a divine entity, I would say, on this planet. And if you don't like the word divine, just swap it with something else. But as a real, authentic human being, this really kind of points to something that I wanted to mention, because we talked about some dark stuff in the last segment. So let's focus on some of the solution-based thing here. One of the key patterns in my work is this, that there really is no one to blame for this other than ourselves. And a lot of people have a problem with that because they want to blame, the Islamists.
Tell me who's on the top of the pyramid, and then I can blame them for all my problems.
That's right.
And everything.
Yes. Depending on who you talk to, they say, it's the reptilian, Anunnaki, shape-shifting bloodline. It's the Zionists. It's the Americans. It's the Pakistanis. It's the the Catholics. It's the Romanists. It's the Egyptian Nefertiti, Akhenaten bloodline. All this stuff, all this fascinating, interesting, weird stuff. My answer to that is none of that is to blame. What is to blame is us. Now, when you consider, and again, consider this, don't have to judge it, or believe it, or disbelieve it. Just consider it, because we can all do that with no trouble. Consider the fact that if everything is one system, and at a fundamental level it is, everything flows into everything else, then there is actually no separation between anything. Now, if you just hold that concept, if we constantly perceive our own inauthenticity and to continue to live lives that are unfulfilling and dull and grey and plastic and just spewed out by the media, when we continue to live like that and don't do anything about it, then our inauthenticity actually becomes what I would say is a disavowal of our own shadow. And this actually produces a very unusual thing. And this principle is absolutely crucial to understanding my philosophy. And this whole evolutionary shift away from control to freedom lies in this. We are the shadow. We are the shadow. All the darkness in the world is us. And as I've said before, every sort of negative entity that we encounter is our fault, and we are accountable for it. So as matter flows from mind, and as consciousness becomes creation around us, we're not allowed to walk away from the challenges that we face on a very personal level in our daily life. We can't just let things disappear and float away, even though we may wish to. Every single challenge that we have, when we ignore it, it goes away for a time, then it comes back bigger and harder and more dense than last time, more destructive than last time. Eventually, on a collective level, this leads to an incredibly dysfunctional human consciousness at a group level. And what you actually get is negative entities, actual entities out there that represent this huge disownment of our own ignored shadow side. And until we face them, they get even more and more extreme, and they turn into these ridiculous dictators and these evil despots. So ignoring a negative energy pattern in yourself will eventually come back and bite you in the ass, basically. And not only that, but when billions of people do it on the planet, that negative pattern comes back as an actual real person or a real event or a real timeline. And each time it comes back, as I say, it gets harder and harder and tougher until eventually it becomes this sort of totally inescapable crisis. So, as I've said in an essay, a single tiny ignored emotional negativity in your own self can result in catastrophic things. So to short circuit this whole kind of routine, any negativity that we find in our own life, the best advice I can do is face it head on. Don't ignore it, don't sedate it, and whether it comes from your intellect or your emotional self or your sexuality or your family life or your workplace, whatever, face it as soon as the negativity arises and trace it to the root, and eventually all the kind of negativity in your own life starts to change color and it starts to dissipate and evaporate a little bit. But we're taught that negative is bad, avoid, avoid, avoid. That is not what we do. We have to kind of face it as a warrior would face an enemy. And when we understand that that enemy is ourselves, then we can treat it in a very different way. So that is why consciousness is so critical to this whole process of enlightenment and understanding the crazy world that we live in, because that enemy is ourselves. In The Prisoner, in Patrick McGowan's 1967 brilliant series, the guy at the head of the whole thing in the final episode, and you might want to just turn your ears away if you've not watched it yet. Here we go, spoiler alert. The guy is himself. So number one on the island, in the village, in Patrick McGowan's Prisoner fictional narrative, is himself. And that is the evil architect of the whole thing, and it's himself. So we are our enemy, so we have to face it to dissolve it. And until we do that, it will keep propagating and manifesting as all these stupid, evil, destructive things in the world. But there isn't anything outside of ourselves. And when we begin to contemplate that fact, then the influence of those negative entities begins to deteriorate, and finally it disintegrates altogether.
Very, very, very interesting. It seems that the complexity of our consciousness does sort of manifest things in different ways too as well, and that if we don't face our fears or face our problems, they manifest in other ways. It seems, let me see here, we do have a caller, looks like Chris in Seattle. Welcome to the Vantage Point. Do you have a question for our guest?
Hello, yeah, I have a question for you. I've always kind of questioned everything as far as even when I was in grade school, and a lot of the history they taught us, and I always had questions about it and doubts. One of the things they taught us was, like you were saying, evolution, how everybody was, like Neanderthals beating around with bones and sticks, and I just always had a hard time with that. And I've been kind of researching a lot into it, the different aspects and the counter theories, and as far as like genetic degeneration and de-evolution, if you could put some input on that.
Yeah, that's a good point you raised there, Chris. It's when you start to look at this thing, you realize that the what is offered up, that seemingly we all accepted as young men and women as Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest, this slow movement from basic forms of life to complex forms of life, is actually a crock, basically. And if you say that in the mainstream conversation, that means by default in the mainstream conversation that then you are a creationist or you are religious. And so they sell up this so-called false dichotomy to say you're either a Darwinian or you're a creationist. You're either a scientist or you're religious, and that's it. Neither of those two things are the case. What we see when we actually study the evidence on this, and when we look at the science and we look at the real historical record, is that the ascent of man happened many, many, many millions of years ago, where his origin was probably the same as everyone else's, was from the stars, from all the different aspects, different intelligences, different minerals and resources and radiation. Everything comes from the same source, essentially. And you can look at that from a religious context, or you can look at it from a scientific context. But when you consider that the story of man is tens, hundreds of millions of years long, then the question arises, of course, well, where is the evidence? The evidence isn't there because every few thousand years, the Earth receives these cataclysmic events, which can be looked at in another way. Cataclysms is how we describe them now. But what it does is, it's kind of like a watershed filtering moment to say, anything that is absolutely reliant on matter, that is encased and enmeshed in matter, is going to get wiped. So it's kind of like,
hang right there. We're coming to a quick break. Be back in a bit.
All right, I'm just going to get a glass of water.
I learned in high school.
It is definitely a timely bumper there because I learned a lot of crap in high school that I had to get rid of and get out of my own head. But back to the last segment of the show, and Neil, I want to thank you really for your information and sort of shifting our own minds. And I hope our listeners got a lot from it. I got a lot from it, even myself. I want to thank you for that. But before we get into the I guess you could say the last subject of the day, are you working on any current projects? Any new projects?
Yeah, I'm. Most of my time at the moment is split between completing a book project I'm working on, which is really sort of all the key philosophy and metaphysics and sacred work that I do. Getting it all into one place, putting it down with my particular distinctive kind of interpretation of these things. So that is, consuming all my time, which is probably, just about ready to go now. The other thing that I'm spending time on is that me and a friend are working on a video project, which started in September last year. So we've done a lot of filming in the UK and the States. And that is really going to provide like sort of a media complementary sort of angle on a lot of the work that I do. So people who are not going to get to see some of the things that I talk about, particularly if I'm talking about sacred sites and stone circles and crop circles and these incredible sort of megalithic structures. But also, like, we did some filming in the New York subway system. And we were looking at various phenomena, but it is all always backed up with, real kind of hands-on philosophy as well. So I very much believe, despite all the abstract, grand theories that we sometimes juggle with on these kind of programs, it's always important to actually bring it in front of your own face so you can smell it, basically. So everything that I do is punctuated with this very, very practical hands-on application. And that is really, really solidified in this book and this video project. So they're going to be available real soon.
Oh, awesome. Matter of fact, whenever you get those projects done in the future, I would love to get you back on the show again. It's been a pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah.
One thing you talked a lot about on your website is the movie Brazil. And I saw it again this weekend, and I see a lot of movies like THX 1138 where they're just just drugging up everybody, but in Brazil, you have the bureaucracy, you have the police state, you have the vain, degenerated society. It's a full money.
It is, yeah, and the frightening thing about Terry Gilliam's film Brazil and George Orwell's book 1984 is that they both show a populace that is completely and totally controlled without any overt force and without any drugs. What they're controlling is the mind of those people. So everything that you see in Brazil, which was quite humorous and funny and a little bit disturbing kind of 20 years ago, now is very, very disquieting and very, very perturbing indeed, because it's all actually come to pass. So it just reminds me, when I look at those things, that our work here as conscious beings, anyone who's awake, who's aware, who's looking at real information and thinking for themselves, there's a responsibility on your shoulders, and it's one that you should take with some sort of dignity and some sort of adventurous spirit, because it is people like that who act as the sort of broadcast stations for everyone else who's interested in this. And the key thing here is that not that we need to stand on our little box in the park and procrastinate and preach and all the rest of it. What we have to do is do our own work, because everything that we do in our consciousness actually filters through to everyone else's as well. So sometimes you don't need to open your mouth at all, and you're still doing your work and you're still sharing. So that might be a foreign concept to some people, but if you understand that consciousness is this field that we're all connected to, and it flows into us and out of us and through us, everybody has access to it. So what you discover, you pass on. What you learn, you also teach. Every learning you have in your own life is a teaching to other people, whether you ever tell them anything about it or not. Of course, there are times when it is good to open your mouth and to put your, fist on the table and say, no, this isn't right, or to say, yes, this is the way. And that, of course, is the human way to take part in the 3D realm. We're always going to move in some sort of polarity. So we have to use a little bit of compassion for the people who are asleep, your brothers and sisters and parents and friends and all the rest of it. Maybe they're asleep, but let's show them some compassion, because it's not always the best thing to wake someone up just because you're awake. They will come to it in their own time, but your responsibility is to work on yourself, is to grow yourself, expand yourself, and become purer.
That's the thing. I've heard people say that, I'm not speaking to so-and-so because they're not awake. And we weren't always awake at one time. I know I wasn't awake at one time in my life, and I can remember that.
We have to have understanding, and we have to have compassion. And it's pretty weak, actually, to discount people just because they won't look at the stuff that you've looked at. That's pointless, absolutely pointless. And play your own game, work at your own consciousness, and walk your own path. That's all you've got to do. And it can actually be a negative distraction to constantly feel like you need to wake people up. You wake people up by making yourself conscious.
I can't say I've woken people up, but people wonder sometimes, like, what the hell are you doing? That sort of like, that inner happiness, that sort of fulfillment that sort of leaks out, and then you smile. I mean, some days,
that's why it's so important, Michael. I mean, that's a really brilliant thing, maybe to begin to close on a little bit, but that's what's so important about this. The reason it's worth doing this, because it's not very well paid. It's not very well, it's not very popular. It's a bit bizarre at times. But the reason it's worth doing, two reasons. One is because it's authentic, and what is authentic is divine. The second thing that we need to understand about this is that it really does turn life back into an adventure. And rather than live this rubbish 70, 80 years of drudgery with, crappy sports and whatever, instead, it becomes an adventure, and it becomes real, and it becomes fulfilling. And that's what people want. If you ask anybody what is the most brilliant thing you could put into your life, it's fulfillment. Because from that comes mystery, comes satisfaction, comes pleasure, comes happiness. And that's what is missing in so many people's lives. So being who you are, seeing things, taking them for what they are, understanding where you are in your own space, and beginning to move forward, beginning to let the consciousness move in your own world, that returns that sense of colour and that vivaciousness back into life, because that's what's so absent from the cultural mainstream stuff. Doesn't matter what movies and music you like, it's always best when it comes from you.
Absolutely, and that was a definitely interesting perspective to leave off on the show. It's be who you are, be who you want to be. It's like, if you have that inner fulfillment, you have that inner smile, the inner happiness, then you don't need drugs. You don't need to buy the lies. You don't need all that crap. All you need, like you said, is that adventure. You can be your own Indiana Jones on the inside.
You said it, baby.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the program, and I'll definitely send you out that archive, and feel free to contact me anytime you're working on any projects, and we'll bring you back on.
Fantastic. Very much enjoyed it. Thank you, Michael.
Oh, thank you very much. That is Neil Kramer, the website, thecleaver.blogspot.com, and my time is just about up. I want to thank everybody out there for listening. I do want to thank everybody out there for sending me emails, especially on the article I wrote on the new Director of National Intelligence Global Governance 2025 document. And, like Neil says, fulfill yourselves. And the world is a playground. I thank you very much.